Well, pleasure to be here with Lazar Bojic and Austin Walne from ARTIS Ventures and Curie.Bio. My name is Ben Kromnick. I lead healthcare and life sciences here for Mercury. Mercury is a banking platform used by most ambitious founders in healthcare and across many other industries. Over the past 5 years, Mercury's delivered a powerful business bank account and credit card loved by over 200,000 startups. We also are partnering with our own internal group called Mercury Raise, which is our founder success platform, where we provide free expert mentorship, fundraising support, and resources designed to take you to the next level, whether that's as a biotech founder or a health tech founder. Today, we're going to talk about lots of different ways that you can do that. Uh, um, we're very lucky to have these incredible investors with us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Austin to introduce himself and his fund, and then we'll continue the conversation.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. As I said, I'm Austin Wall. I'm a partner at ARTIS Ventures. I've been at the firm for about 10 years. Before that, my background was actually in software before I got into this space. And so I sort of come from that background and that approach to things. But within our firm, we're all sort of generalists. And I sit on the board of therapeutics company, med device company, and a couple software companies. And ARTIS Ventures, if you're not familiar, we're an early stage venture firm focused at the intersection of software, healthcare, and biology. We coined a term, I don't know, gosh, back in like 2018 called Tech.Bio, which I think now has become like oddly controversial in some circles about like what it means and what it's supposed to be and everything. But honestly, back then we were struggling to describe to people how we thought what we were doing was different from traditional biotech investors or traditional software investors. And so we said we like investing in tech companies, we like investing in life science companies, but it's really exciting to us is companies that are sitting in sort of that Venn diagram overlap between the two, that are using computational biology or using computer engineering principles to do new things in life science that weren't necessarily possible before. And so we just kind of made that up, writing it on a napkin. It wasn't trying to change how people think about building companies and everything at the time. It was literally just a way to describe what we were doing, because frankly, at the time, no one understood it, particularly LPs when we were trying to raise a fund. And so that's honestly where the term came from. But and then over time, we started to do a lot more. I would broadly define it as health tech, which is really any application of software to expand access to care or lower cost care delivery, everything from back end efficiency software, behind the scenes in healthcare, connecting payers, providers, direct to consumer, all the way to tech-enabled services.
That's great. Thanks so much, Austin. Lazar, love to hear a little bit about you and your background, along with Curie.Bio and your team over there.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and really appreciate the invite. Happy to be here today. I run a function at Curie that's called Investor Network. I'll describe what that is in just a few minutes, but by background, originally a biochemist by training, earned my PhD in the study of how fat, cholesterol, carbohydrate metabolism impacts heart disease, but in the diabetic state specifically. And then I moved into the industry straight away. And I've been in the industry now for 12, 13 years, spanning drug discovery, which I did at Merck, in small molecule drug discovery and diabetes. Moved into flagship pioneering after Merck and did company creation for several years. And then I ran corporate development for a gene therapy company called enGene, which is now a publicly traded company that is running a pivotal study in non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. And I was part of the team that designed that molecule, which is now behaving very nicely in the clinic. And so I'm very happy about that. Throughout each of those stops, I was always 1 foot deeply in science and 1 foot in either business development or investor-facing roles. And so at Curie, the head of investor network role really means that I do all things investors. So on the front end of things, I work with the founders of Curie to help raise the funds out of which we deploy capital. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, once our portfolio companies have executed on their experimental plans, which I'll describe in just a second, I help them raise their next round of institutional capital by helping them make their deck, their memo, their data room, all the things that they need to go out and talk to investors. And then I make introductions to firms, much like an investment banker would do, but I happen to be a scientist, so I can get deep in the weeds on the science and help them make those investor-facing materials. That is just one of several functions that we provide as, if you will, services to founders to help them on their path of drug discovery. So a quick word on Curie. We are a early stage therapeutics venture firm, but with a twist, which is that we've built out a very large operating company of 90 people, all of which are dedicated full-time employees. We're probably going to grow that to somewhere between 110 and 120 over the next year or so. And most of my colleagues are actually hardcore drug discovery experts. These are folks that have taken an idea and led it all the way through into the clinic, and in many instances also all the way through to an approved drug. So this is a very senior team of hardcore drug discovery scientists. And the reason that we hired so many drug discovery scientists is to be able to help us with diligence on incoming opportunities, just like most other venture firms. But importantly, that once we get excited about a piece of science that we think can translate into a transformational drug for patients, for that particular opportunity, our group of drug discovery scientists will actually help craft the experimental plan to make that drug. And then after we write the check, we'll help execute on that experimental plan to get that to somewhere in the zip code of a development candidate. Not in all cases. In some cases, it's like a late lead optimization molecule. In some cases, it's a development candidate. In others, it's a clinic-ready molecule, maybe even some initial clinical data. But we invest in those early stage therapeutics opportunities, somewhere around an idea to somewhere around a development candidate, and we help founders execute on that path so that by the end of our seed investment, they have made real drug discovery progress such that downstream investors like ARTIS, for example, can then invest at the Series A and then take that molecule all the way to the end of a clinical activity study, which is a major value inflecting milestone in the life cycle of a biotech company.
Thanks so much, gentlemen. One of the reasons I'm excited to have this conversation is there's a shared thread between the three of us in that we serve in very much a supporting function of entrepreneurship and of building. But we come at that support from deep empathy and a lot of scars, probably. I know one of the things that my background's in building clinical research informatics businesses. Got started out in enterprise software, moved over into AI consulting for Fortune 100s about 10 years ago, and then transitioned from that full time into building clinical research informatics companies, where I got the opportunity to go from an idea through having a couple hundred employees, a couple tens of millions in revenue, and done that path a couple of times. And now I feel incredibly lucky because I spend pretty much all day just talking to CEOs, helping them solve where their biggest problem is. And I always love seeing the smile on a CEO's face when I ask them like a real operational question. I was talking to a dental biotech company today, fascinating saliva testing company. And I started digging in deep on like FQHC dental operations, and he was really confused for a little bit. And then he realized that he was talking to somebody who has deep operating experience, who really wants to help him build his company and can dig in on the levers that really matter, that both he feels emotionally and personally as a founder, but also that his business is experiencing. And I found that to be incredibly effective as a support function. It also means that we have another side of the equation, which is we have to know what's going on the other side of the value proposition with that founder, which is oftentimes being the experts in the capital markets and in the corporate development markets that are contemporary for that founder's market. So I'd love if we can talk a little bit, like, let's think high level for a bit. You guys are both actively allocating capital right now across the healthcare spectrum, and for a founder, almost always problem number one or problem number 1B is raising capital right now. And that capital can be dilutive capital, like what comes from funds like yours, or it can be non-dilutive capital through grants or contracts with federal or state agencies. I'd love if you can share just like what is your current pulse on the capital markets in healthcare? Um, Obviously, we had a couple of really hard cycles, especially around telehealth had a really hard cycle. Then the AI boom happened. And we're sort of the AI boom is maturing, and now there's some instability in NIH and HHS funding around sort of like foundational research. How are you reading the current capital markets, and how does your firm actually integrate that read into its investment decisions today? If I'm a founder coming in, how should I think about the macro market as it relates to Artis or as it relates to Curie?
I guess I can get us started. And that glimmer of a smile with the operational excellence, we get that a lot, and we love to see it as well. One of the common misconceptions about Curie is that we work with only academic founders, and that's just not true. We have a portfolio of 26 companies, about half of which are academics and about half of which are former industry executives. And those folks really see the value because they know that drug discovery is really hard. And when they're like, wait a second, Curie can help me with all of these things. You have the biologists on staff, you have the chemists on staff, you have the structural biologists. They get really excited. And so I can totally relate to that, like, oh, wow, operational excellence when we see it. As it relates to capital markets, I mean, maybe a controversial hot take, but like good ideas that are rooted in fundamental data will get rewarded. And I think that's kind of what we at least are seeing, not only from the perspective of like allocating capital out of Curie into ideas, but then also on the back end. Like when we help these companies get to a development candidate that gains investor traction and attention, because now all of a sudden you
Yeah.
have a molecule that is seemingly progressible. And I think what we saw in 2020 and 2021 was a lot of hype cycles around platforms. And it was kind of funny.
Mhm.
One of the inbound questions from the audience was, well, what do you see as a common mistake that people make when they pitch? And if you say that you can do anything, then no one will believe you that you can do a single thing. And that's kind of where we were in 2020, 2021, first half of 22, is a lot of platforms, big, sexy science, but no like fundamental assets coming out of it. And I think
Yep.
kind of gone back to let's make the drugs. And if you make the drugs, you'll get rewarded, meaning you'll raise capital. It'll probably be at a pretty decent price. Investors will see the progressibility and they'll push you to that next value inflecting milestone. But that's my take on that.
Hey, Austin, before you jump in here, Lazar, why did you think that's a controversial take?
Because you talk to anybody out there, you talk to especially founders, and you go to events, you go to conferences, you go to, these like happy hours and whatnot, and everybody's talking about like winter.
Mm.
I think it's always a big knee-jerk reaction from, we'll look at the state of the public biotech markets. And I always flip that back around and I say, well, look at the state of the public biotech markets. Where's the XBI today? Where was the XBI in Q4 2019? And like, forget about the interim.
Hmm.
If you just compare present day to Q4 2019, we're at all-time highs. But people still have in their mind the highs of 170 on the XBI, and that we're still down whatever 40, 50%. And that's in their mind's eye. So they think biotech winter, but in reality, it's no, there's contraction, but it was contraction of companies that didn't have fundamental value.
Yeah. I think there's an additional factor to that, which is fundraising is hard. It has always been hard and it will continue to be hard. And it's probably going to be the hardest thing that a founder does. And so it always feels like it's the worst, because there's never a better. Like it's just a hard thing to do. Getting another institution to gain enough conviction to purchase your equity when you are so early and so risky, which is where you guys really play, is just a hard thing to do. And I was talking to another founder this morning, and we're talking about it's like he's raising 600K on a pre-seed, and I was like, oh, like well, why? Like, what are you trying to prove with that 600K? And his answer was, well, I want to get to 30% market share. I was like, wow, 30% market share on 600K is ridiculous. How are you going to do that? And what he really meant was he was trying to get to a specific cohort of physicians to use his product 30% of the time. And it's like, wow, okay, that's actually awesome. What's the right sample size for 30% penetration of a procedure? And we worked from this sort of like amorphous milestone set to I'm gonna get 100 docs using this on 30% of their patients. Like, all right, well, like you can do that with 600K. I get that. And is 100 enough to go raise your Series A? And that I always found like it's always going to be hard, but when you know exactly what your milestones are, that's going to motivate that next stage. That can be so important. Austin, I'd love to hear from you. What is Artis's general perspective on the market today? How are you seeing it? Because you are multi-stage. I mean, you guys have companies in your portfolio that are at incubation. You have some that are, in your Series B and later. How do you think about the milestone progression as well, and have the milestones shifted as the capital markets have shifted?
So I'm going to try to not make this panel where we all agree on everything, but I do agree with everything you guys have said so far, and it totally tracks with what we're seeing as well. One quick I will attempt to directly answer your question, but one thing to add on to kind of what you guys were saying and about, especially what you were saying, Ben, about how fundraising is always hard, and Lazar, you were saying about our trend line that we're sort of on trend X the crazy money printer years, is that since I've been in venture, and now I feel like an old person saying this because it's literally been 10 years. Ever since I first got into the industry, people were talking about the Series A crunch and how it's Series A is just really, really tough, and there's not enough people writing Series A deals for the amount of seed deals. And I did some homework before the panel and looked at some data from another bank, which I won't mention, and in PitchBook, and saw that seed deals are something like 40% of all deals getting done right now. There's like 2x in the last year, 2x the number of seed deals versus Series A. And so if by that definition, so you could still say, oh, there's a Series A crunch because there's only seed deals and there's not enough A getting done. But I think that's actually maybe natural in how the world should be, that there should be a lot more it's a funnel. There's going to be way more seed deals getting done than there are the A deals. And A is typically your first sort of traditional, this A is typically thought of as your first institutional round of funding. That's not true anymore because Lazar is running a very large institution and they're doing seed deals. So, but it is still a significant sort of inflection point for a company, I guess, to raise capital. Typically, well, nothing is typical anymore. So I'm going to stop trying to make blanket statements, but oftentimes, an A round in life science companies is when you may start running some type of human trials. We might start a phase 1 with a Series A. We see that a lot, at least. And so that is a much bigger hurdle than it is to raise capital to run some animal studies, just because of the amount of money involved. But I think the markets have refound a state of equilibrium, putting us back on track for how things were ex the COVID years. And if you just look at the deals that we did in 2023, we basically made no investments. We made one, and we did eight investments the year prior. We did 8 investments in 2024. And we're probably on track to do about 8 investments this year. That's about our pace over time. And 2023 was this weird year because the market had corrected, but there was a big spread between buyers and sellers of seed Series A deals. But that seems to have leveled out now, and things are getting done.
So there's an interesting dynamic that I'm observing. So one of the things that's fascinating about our position at Mercury, we have more than 11,000 healthcare companies that use us as their banking platform, which means we get to see this broad swath of the market. And what's fun about that is it's not just biotech. We have about 800 biotech companies that bank with us, and we have a couple thousand that are more like health tech, and the rest are health services. And I see, especially in health tech, there's just a lesser attrition out of biotech, but it does happen as well, is some companies naturally should be tech-enabled services businesses, but they don't know that yet when they raise their seed round. So often I find companies, they get through their pre-seed, they get their seed, they start getting customers, and they realize that the only way to scale their business model is by either owning a procedure. So think about a telehealth platform who realize that it's just really hard to sell enterprise software to the hospital systems, and that they won't pay enough to make it worth it long term. But if they can move those procedures into their platform, then they end up building a provider network, and then then they're never going to raise a traditional Series A, because now they're a services business. Now they look great for debt because they're ramping their revenue, but they have a higher cost structure. Um, I find this happens frequently in the like seed to Series A transit, when they start to really get the pressure of, can you scale this business model? And those Series A institutional investors are looking at them and going, these economics don't fit for me. So I think also that point of 40% of the volume being done in seed, I think there's a fraction of that attrition isn't company death, which is a significant amount between seed and Series A, but it's this pivot into tech-enabled services, which I don't remember which founder it was, but one of the prolific LinkedIn founders, put a great post out, essentially saying like, let's run the equity economics on a tech-enabled services business that raises like $1 million and then scales through procedures or through services, versus the pure tech play that raises $100 million or $500 million. What does the actual post-tax exit look like for that founder if it's successful? And so often you can do better as a founder from an economics perspective by getting to a 10, 20, $30 million run rate services business that's got great margins. And if you want to sell out of that thing, you totally can. And you can sell out while owning, significant double-digit percentages of the company, if not more than 50% of the company when you sell. When you are talking to your founders, Austin, after you've invested, and you're thinking about how do you take this company to the next level, how do you think about kind of that trade-off between going into the procedure, going into the services model versus staying in kind of the core technology model?
I mean, I think it's gonna vary on a case by case basis, but in a lot of cases, it's where are you showing that you can generate value. I think we've seen some companies sort of like what you described that thought they could be software companies, that they would have sort of natural partners for what they were doing, and they just struggled to get traction with that, and so they didn't really have any other choice than to sort of take on more pieces of the process and just do it themselves and then prove it out that way. And what's interesting too is in some of those cases, they thought they would be potentially they thought they were building a solution to service providers. The providers weren't interested in it. They essentially became the provider and then found that the payers were really excited to work with them. And so it was just, they had the wrong, what they were working on was the right thing, but they had the wrong assumption about who the eventual customer
Yeah.
is at the end of the day. And I think the other thing and I think this was in one of our background questions or something too, was just talking about value-based care, and that that business model becoming more and more viable, and showing more and more, there's more and more interest from investors in that space, and from partners, that that's a different place you can sort of pivot into as well, that you can generate value using that approach in a different way that you couldn't if you were just doing a sort of fee for service model. And so we've seen companies make that a consideration, a part of their shift too, is, well, if we become more services based, could we then actually generate really significant revenue, potentially more revenue, by taking on risk, or sometimes not even having to take on the risk, which has we've been really interesting in a couple of cases as well.
So I've been a part of a company where we loved our tech vision. We were so like, the technology was really cool. It was breakthrough search technology, breakthrough natural language processing technology. And um, we were too in love with it. And there were other models that could have been really successful. And that's a hard people problem. So I'm gonna ask Lazar here, when you're thinking about, you've got these early molecules sometimes, and that science is going to evolve throughout its development life cycle. When you're picking a CEO, whether it's as an actual CEO to come in and run a piece of science that you guys have developed internally, or you're picking a CEO as part of an investment, how do you diligence for a founder who's going to follow the science, kind of no matter where it leads? And I guess if they're this almost like a really interesting corollary between following the science and following like the business model to its like logical best state. Lazar, how do you diligence that?
I'm going to answer that question slightly differently, which is, first of all, when we invest in therapeutics businesses that are coming from the marketplace of ideas. And so we don't really come up with our own ideas. We don't like incubate our own things because that would kind of be competing with our customer, if you will. And so we are more reactionary to ideas that are inbound to us, which means that they're fundamentally the founders' companies. And when it's the founders' company and we're trying to free the founders, you've probably seen that slogan, we're trying to free the founders economically, where it's your idea, you had the creative spark for the novel target modulation hypothesis, for the new way to drug a specific target, or you have biological insights onto a given target where you think that that would play in a particular patient population. That creative spark is fundamentally valuable because if you didn't have that idea, then there would be no company for us to invest in. And so we feel that founders should be economically rewarded for those creative sparks for new therapeutics businesses. And when the economics are lopsided in the favor of taking on the risk to start your own company, it's very easy to answer the question, do you want to be rich or do you want to be king or queen, the right way? Because if you just want to be the king or queen of your own castle, you will make all the decisions that are inherently self-serving and not inherently good for the business. Now, you can always work with people. There's always ways to figure that out. But nevertheless, when the economics are tilted in the favor of doing what's right to advance the molecules and doing what's right to advance the science because you want to make a drug, because the economics are going to be worth something. Now all of a sudden that decision-making capacity just becomes a lot more logical and a lot less emotional. And while we don't concretely, like people ask me all the time, what do you think are the best characteristics for the best types of people to work with? And my personal answer, this is like, opinions are my own, just like on Twitter, where I don't have many followers and I don't really use the platform. But anyway, if you have a narrow emotional band, if you have a steady hand on the rudder, and you're a logic-driven decision maker, it is infinitely easier to work with that phenotype of person because drug discovery is really hard. And so you're going to have these wild swings in data. So therefore, you have to have that narrow emotional band. You have to have a steady hand on the rudder so you know how to navigate the difficulty of drug discovery. And if you're a logic-driven decision maker, then you're going to make the right decisions for the business. So I hope that answered your question kind of indirectly, because like I think it's actually important to convey.
So how often have you seen, or how are you able to de-risk the fact that human beings, founders, are not always inherently logical?
I mean, some of the best visionary scientists are actually not always logical. But it's not really rocket science to diligence it. It's like you do 10 reference, like when you're diligencing something and you go and you talk to 10 experts, you're going to saturate at somewhere between 6 and 8. If you don't, you have massively divergent viewpoints and that market's like a mess. Same thing, when you're diligencing, just like any hire, you can easily diligence a founder and you ask them for the references. You go talk to 6, 8, 10 people. Eventually that'll saturate. You'll find out the strengths, you'll find out the weaknesses, you'll find out the things that people didn't say. And then you'll know how to work with that individual. And so, like I said, it's not like all or none. It's not like only logic-driven people. It's figure out what the optimal way is to work with somebody based on their intrinsic personality traits. And you can always find a way.
Great, thanks so much. Austin, I'd love to have you chime in here. How do you guys at ARTIS think about diligencing, the human side of these unknown future decisions that will directly impact the business? How do you solve for that in the pre-investment cycle?
Well, I don't know if you can solve for any of it. I mean, that's a tricky bar to put on it, but you can do your best to mitigate it. And we look at a lot of the founders we've invested in have are that's an interesting point that I should run the data on. I don't know off the top of my head how many of our founders are first time versus repeat founders, but I know we have a good number of either repeat founders or folks who came from somewhere in industry before they started the company. This isn't, they're not totally fresh out of academia. And so typically there is some body of evidence to what they've done in the past. And they may not have been the CEO of the previous company, but they've been the VP of clinical development, or maybe they were the chief scientific officer at a startup, and then this time they're the CEO. And so that's going to be a shift, and it's not going to be the exact same process, but there's something that you can look at, and just like Lazar, we have a similar process. We go talk to people who've worked with them in the past and get a sense of what they're like. And then at the end of the day, you're you're taking a gamble on people. That's why we have a portfolio of investments. Is you can never people aren't robots. You never know exactly how, just because they reacted one way to some challenge in the past doesn't mean they're going to do it in the future. But if you're looking for tendencies or traits and things, I think we look for evidence of resiliency. People that have, and that's, you can try to pull that out from talking to people, or asking questions to people they worked with before. But have they dealt with some kind of significant, have they gotten kicked in the teeth before in something they're working on and still gotten back up and continued to work through it? I think is an important piece. I think that adaptability, willingness to change your mind when presented with new evidence, I think is really important too. So we sort of look for that in people. And then honestly, we really, these days, I think, I don't know if this is always the case, but just look for people who are really collaborative and that are willing to, work together to solve challenges, because, you're going to get involved with some of these folks for a decade. And the average, I mean, I think it's kind of a cliche statement, but it's true that the average seed investment lasts longer than the average marriage in America. And it's actually easier to get divorced than it is to divest an investment, private a venture investment. And so you're basically kind of stuck together. And so I think one of the things we're really looking for is this someone that we want to work with for the next years? And is this someone that when things start to go poorly, because inevitably things will go poorly at some time, is this person going to, be positive to work with, together to solve those challenges? Or, are we all going to be pulling our hair out? And you never know. You never have any, we've been wrong about that in some cases, but more times than not, I think we've gotten lucky in selecting the folks to work with, that when things did get tough, we took a team-based approach and worked through it together. Whether that's this got, the hypothesis was wrong, the science came back wrong, the inner team dynamics, co-founder dynamics made a hire that everyone thought was going to be a rock star, and then they turned out to be toxic. There's all sorts of different ways things can go wrong, but having that sort of willingness to work together and being resilient in the face of that, I think, are probably two of the biggest non sort of academic or background or credential elements that we're really looking for in people.
And I think one other thing to just draft off of what Austin was saying, which is like, when you're working with people, he said that a few times, really senior people, especially, and then really smart people have figured out all of the pattern recognition in question and answer sessions, and they get really good at either like fibbing, faking, lying, or just like being really good at regurgitating answers that they've heard a bazillion times that they don't actually know anything about. And so the best way to cut through that, and by the way, I'm saying this not just from the perspective of like what I'm about to say in the Curie context, but also for founders. One great way to diligence people, it's not perfect, but like one great way to diligence people, if you don't do it already, is case-based interviews. The best way to know what it's like to work with somebody is to actually work with that person. And so with Curie, one of the things that we do is, and I alluded to this earlier, but our diligence process early on is not that dissimilar from many venture firms. We come to a thesis on the science, we come to a thesis on the investment. But what's very unique with Curie is that we go through this planning phase of planning out the seed experimental plan before we cut the check. And that is active, deep in the weeds, scientific preparation, what are the assays, model systems, how far do we need to help them push progress? And that's a very active working time frame. And so during that phase, if you start to get a spidey sense about people, then you know what to look out for because now you're working with them. You see some of those warts. So post check writing, you should have a pretty good idea, coupled to the reference checks that I mentioned earlier, of what you will, what it's going to be like to work with that person or those people.
Thanks so much, guys. I want to give a quick shout out to our Mercury Raise team who's going to post a poll here on how helpful this was. Oh, wow. Right on time. And now I'm going to move to taking a couple of questions. So some of you actually submitted questions ahead of the webinar, which was awesome. There were too many for us to possibly get to. There was one that particularly stuck out to me because it hits on two macro trends, and it's sort of in this space of like, how do you grow and build a company today in the healthcare and life sciences space? And it's thinking, I'll read it specifically, but given the current fundraising climate, how are investors evaluating biotech companies that straddle the line between consumer health and longevity biotech? And are there specific business models or go-to-market strategies that make these companies more attractive to VCs? The reason I really like that question is I think that longevity and another frame around that, which is commonly used, is health span, today has really been concentrated in this like cash only distribution model. We so often see it in the context of biohacking or these incredibly expensive and elective procedures and protocols that totally Brian Johnson can do, but a regular person who gets up and goes to work every day will never be able to achieve that protocol. And I'm a personal believer that we have the potential to impact the health span of the entire planet. And that is in many cases, might be a moral obligation if you're building in the space. So how does somebody build in that space right now? And what are some of the most exciting models that you're seeing where we are maybe borrowing a lot from the consumer health trends that have happened over the last decade, where, you can get, really easy access to very specific molecules that solve very, very broad population-based health issues, and the radical advancements we've made in longevity and health span. Do we see those two things coming together, and how are you observing them coming together in a way that is either maybe staying in this super high value, super high ticket cost therapeutic space versus the broad awareness and availability space that's we can do for hair care and skin care and all those other things. So I'd love to hear us talk a little bit about that from the perspective of your firms, and then that will probably be our last question.
Austin, you want to start?
Sure. It's an interesting question because traditionally, like we looked at I guess longevity or aging as spaces for, we've been looking at it for as long as I can remember the firm, and I don't think we've made a single direct investment in the aging longevity sort of space. There's been some good companies that we saw along the way that maybe we had an opportunity to invest in, and they're doing great now, and maybe we should have invested in it. But I think one of the things that we always struggled with was, what are your endpoints for a lot of these drugs? Since the FDA doesn't classify aging as a disease, And you can find things along the way. That's what most of these companies that have been successful have done. They found some indication that's and kind of comes at it, orthogonally, to put it from a different angle. That's different. That works toward solving these problems of aging or longevity, but from an angle that I think they could actually get a drug approved. I think what's been interesting that I've been seeing lately, we haven't made any investments in this space exactly, and Ben, you referenced, I think, one of the challenges of investing in the space, talking about the consumer health things like hair care and ED medicines and stuff, is that I think there's some interesting businesses being built around some of these biohacking things, which in some ways look like using software to bring down the cost of concierge medicine. And that you look at the GLP-1 space. There's you can buy the labeled drugs that are extremely expensive, but there are very similar analog drugs that you can get through compounding pharmacies, and the likes of Hims and Noom and all of these consumer health companies have now back to our earlier question about tech-enabled services. Now suddenly they're offering these pretty high margin therapeutics through their own compounding pharmacies and building, I think, some pretty significant businesses around it. And I would honestly put that into a longevity category personally, because if you're obesity is probably the number one negative drag on people's longevity and health span. So, putting aside GLP-1s and the issues and challenges with them, you're seeing some positive effects with people there. So I think there are some other interesting businesses to be built, layering on, if you want to, I guess we'll call it tech-enabled services, but using software to provide the sort of wraparound services required to maximize some of these, call it, biohacking things. Some of them are using compounds that are, things in the peptide space. I think there's interesting stuff happening in peptides. Can't invest in peptides because none of them are patentable molecules. But we didn't touch on regulatory earlier, but you believe what you've read from some of the leaders of the new healthcare, running healthcare in the new administration. They are very interested in some of these, you can call it alternative therapies. And is there a way to make money off of those? It's probably around some sort of services business built around to deliver those in a evidence data driven way, not just reading what someone posted on Twitter and ordering it off the internet. So that's an area I think is interesting. We haven't made any investments in that space, but in broadly speaking, I think it's if you have unlimited money, you can get some really awesome longevity care. You can hire these amazing longevity focused concierge medicine doctors that are out there. The rest of us are, it's a bit more challenging. And so I think that's an area where software can drive down the cost of accessing some of those capabilities for more and more people. So I think that's an interesting area.
I would just say, what problem are you solving? From a therapeutics perspective, like what are you trying to accomplish with the longevity aging thing? Austin already mentioned this, which is like there's no FDA label for aging. And so if you just think about like the course of human history and what life expectancy was, where it is today, and the things that should have killed you that don't kill you anymore, and where that trajectory is going, we can just kind of map it. And you can say, like, what was life expectancy like 150 years ago? It was like 40 years old, right? People were dying in the 30s and upwards of 40. And now we've doubled that. But that's only happened in the last 120 years. And the reason for that is things like air conditioning and better food preservation, vaccines, antibiotics. And then in the last 50 years, the advent of statins to control LDL cholesterol. Like, the point being, if heart disease doesn't kill you, cancer will kill you. And if cancer doesn't kill you, the brain wasn't actually designed to live to 80, 90, 100 years old. And so the problem then one, at least in my opinion, ought to solve are neurodegenerative diseases. Let's run that experiment. And once we get on the other side of that, let's see what life expectancy is and then what problem we're solving. And I would posit, again, opinions are my own, that it's not telomere length. Crazy thought.
Should we end on that hot take that it's not telomere length?
I think that's a great. I think that's a great. I think that's a great high point.
That is a great point. Hey, thank you both for the conversation. This has been really enjoyable, and I know if I were starting my first company like I did in 2016, I really wish I would have listened to this conversation. The amount of like systemic thought I think is really, really helpful. So if you're a first-time founder or a nth time founder, I'm really glad that you're able to listen to these two gentlemen. Let's take us home really quickly. Like, both of you guys, like, what's the best way for a founder to engage with your funds, and really specifically, when should they not come to you? When is it an obvious this is the wrong time? I think it's such a strong filter because there really is such a hard matchmaking function between an investor and a founder. So when is the right time and when is explicitly the wrong time for a founder to come and work with you guys?
If you're working on therapeutics, any time is the right time. And if you have a great therapeutics idea that you haven't even written down on a proverbial napkin, we're more than happy to be a thought partner in what that could look like from an evolution of your therapeutics idea perspective. And oftentimes we see people doing the experiments that will advance the basic science, but not necessarily the investability. And so we're more than happy, and like what better way to have like access to that resource than to just call upon Curie and say, like, is this an interesting therapeutics idea? And what experiments, if not ready yet, would make this investable? So anytime is the right time. And truly, email, website, honestly, we do look at every single thing that comes in on the door because that comes in through the door because we've built the infrastructure to support that. Out of the 26 investments we've done so far, one actually came from a very prominent academic scientist who, believe it or not, submitted through the website. Everything gets its due attention. And so the best way to get in touch is any mode you'd like. And the best time to get in touch is anytime if you're working on a therapeutics idea.
I'd say for us, I mean, it's in some ways a similar answer. I mean, look, we're probably not going to invest in a therapeutics company at the idea stage if you're still if you're as you're spinning out of academia, but we're happy to talk to you. And it may be it may be if nothing else coming out of the conversation, we'll try to give you really direct feedback about your pitch, about what you're focused on, about your process that you're suggesting, to try to help you be successful in raising that round before us. And then hopefully if we had a positive interaction, you'll come back when it is a bit more mature and something we're ready to invest in. I think if it's these days sort of series where we are in the fund life cycle, series B is a little tough for us right now. So if you're starting to get that later stage, we probably don't have the fund. We're sort of reaching the tail end of the current fund we're investing out of, so it's probably a little bit late for us. And then on the healthcare side, I think having some basic product that's developed, revenue and maybe some traction would be awesome. Is where we're looking, at least right now. And a lot of that's honestly driven not just by what we're interested in, what we're seeing in the market, but literally where we are in the fund cycle. Like we're in year 3 of our fund investing cycle. And so at least on the software side, we're looking for things that are just a little bit further, more in development than maybe we were 3 years ago when we were first investing out of this fund.
Well, thank you again so much for your time today and for the perspective on the market, on your own funds. I hope that everybody who attended and is listening, it really sees that Mercury partners with its founders and with its partners really from this like date of ideation. When you really have that first spark, like that, like you said, Lazar, like that spark is so meaningful. Being able to create the infrastructure and the environment around it that helps it achieve its sort of logical end. That's what we do here at Mercury, especially in the healthcare and life sciences space, where we partner from ideation all the way up through massive scale, all the way up through the public markets. And we have wonderful partners with the Mercury Raise team as well, helping our founders and our community access investors. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you, the Mercury Raise team, and thank you, Austin, and thank you, Lazar. I appreciate it, you all.